Okay, good morning. Today, this is the joint Summer Government Accountability Committee. We continue to call it the Summer Government Accountability Committee because, yeah, right, we started in the fall on our work. However, it's what it was noted in the legislation. So it is Wednesday, December 13th. How many days to shop? And we have a busy agenda today. Actually, we are going to start off with Anthea Dexter Cooper talking to us a bit about LCAR and I'm going to just say that LCAR is legislative. What is it exactly?
On administrative rules.
Okay, thank you. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what we are doing similar to LCAR, which is great. It's wonderful to see that we're putting some things in our report that actually is beginning to happen inside of the building. So that's the first thing. And then at 11 o'clock, we're going to hear from Susanna Davis from the Office of Racial Equity, and we'll be talking about those last sections of the legislation. At 1 o'clock, we'll take a break for lunch, a short one. You might even want to read over again the report, which everyone has a copy of the report in front of them. And we did that because in case you want to take one home, to just have what we've been talking about and referring to. But we will be going over that at 1:30, and we'll be here until we vote on it, hopefully. That's what we're hoping for. So that's our day. And why don't we start with Anthea talking to us a bit about LCAR. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. So for the record, my name is Anthea Dexter Cooper. I'm an attorney in the Office of Legislative Counsel. Those of you who know me usually know me in my capacity as staffing matters related to transportation. I'm also the committee counsel for the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, known as LCAR, and I staff that committee from a procedural perspective, and then I have assistance on all of the substantive matters related to the rules that come before LCAR from my colleagues on Leg Counsel. So to sort of bring everyone up to speed with respect to some recommendations that have been made to your committee and to LCAR, and some of the work that LCAR has been doing over the last, let's say, year and a half here, I'm just going to run through a little bit of a timeline of some work that's been done and then show you a couple documents. And then I'm happy to answer questions on anything that I've talked about and also on the rulemaking process in general, if you have questions there. I know it's sort of this like foreign part of the legislative process in that when properly adopted, rules have the full force and effect of law, yet very few members, aside from those that are on LCAR, necessarily are involved in that final part where a rule becomes a rule. So in the summer of 2022, the auditor's office made 3 recommendations to LCAR. These recommendations will sound pretty similar because they are recommendations that were also made to Summer GAC. The auditor's office recommended that new and amended rulemaking be tracked, that when rulemaking was going to be mandatory, such and so agency shall adopt a rule, that there be a deadline, and that checkbacks be required if rulemaking was going to be mandatory, and that those checkbacks would come to the committees of jurisdiction. In the fall of 2022, LCAR started working on recommendation 1, that's the tracking new and amended rulemaking, and asked Leg Counsel, the Office of Legislative Counsel, to start tracking new and amended rulemaking starting with the 2023 legislative session. So as opposed to looking back at past years and trying to create a database of things that may or may not have happened, to start prospectively going forward. And earlier this year, you heard from Jennifer Carby about the work that's done in terms of the act summaries that are prepared, and starting with the 2023 legislative session, the act summary included a table that needed to be filled out for each act to talk about new and amended rulemaking. And I turned that into a database, and that is going to be updated going forward from there. That database, and I'm going to share my screen, has been posted to your committee's page for today. It looks like this. You can see that it's got columns starting at the left that talk about the year of the act number, and what the applicable section is. Everything there is 2023, since this is only the 2023 portion of the database, but it will build from here. You'll see 2024 acts, 2025, and so on. The statutory authority for the rulemaking, that's significant because one of the grounds that LCAR can object to a rule is that it does not have, the adopting agency doesn't have the statutory authority. The topic of the rule, the committees of jurisdiction that would be reviewing the rule, the adopting agency, if it's new rulemaking, so sometimes there'll be an amendment to existing rulemaking authority, sometimes new rulemaking authority will be made. If it is mandatory, that shall adopt versus may adopt, and if there are any pertinent dates, and then any notes to sort of bring to LCAR's attention or the committees of jurisdiction's attention. The other thing I want to point out on this report is it has a little disclaimer at the bottom. It says, and I'll read it so you don't have to squint, this document is being maintained as a convenience for the General Assembly to track new and amended rulemaking authority starting with the 2023 legislative session. It should not be relied upon as an authoritative or exhaustive list. And the reason why we included that disclaimer there was it is not Ledge Council's job to be telling the administration their responsibilities in terms of rulemaking, nor is it LCAR's job, and nor do Ledge Council or LCAR have the authority, and we'll get to this in the next piece of LCAR's response to the recommendations, nor does LCAR have the authority to force rulemaking if it's not being done by the agency that has been tasked with it. So that's what LCAR and Ledge Council have done to respond to the auditor's first recommendation. In the spring of 2023, LCAR sent a memo on rulemaking considerations and a flow chart that could be used to the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction and to Jen Carby, the Director and Chief Counsel, responding to the second two recommendations from the auditor's office that a deadline be included for mandatory rulemaking and requiring checkbacks. That memo went out on April 13th of 2023. I think everyone was a little bit busy when that happened, and maybe this flew under the radar, so to speak. Let me switch over to that. It went to the chairs of the standing committees and Jen, as I mentioned, to the speaker and the president pro tem. One of the things that it was included in the memo at the beginning was that members of LCAR can be available for a discussion on this at future chairs meetings. I also can be available, so this can be something that is an ongoing conversation. It talked about a prior memo that had been sent on legislative intent. That's sort of outside the scope of what we're talking about today, but that is something that exists if you're interested in seeing it. And then it goes on to the real bulk, the meat of the memo, which is to sort of talk about considerations that chairs and committees of jurisdiction as they're working on rulemaking can think about in terms of whether to require rulemaking, whether to establish a timeline or deadlines for rulemaking, and whether to require checkbacks. Before getting to this tool, which is a flow chart that I'm going to walk through in a second, it also talked about how LCAR does not have the statutory authority to force rulemaking and the consequences that are not really been utilized if an adopting agency does not go forward with adopting rules as they're required to do. And you can see some more information there in some of the footnotes at the end of the document. What I think you're really going to be interested in is to see what LCAR was recommending in terms of this tool that can be used to address these broad rulemaking considerations. So the first one is considerations for requiring, and I'm working at the left of the flow chart over to the right, considerations for requiring rulemaking. So if you're going to have that shall adopt versus may adopt, things that should be considered, whether a rule or rules are necessary in the near term. Is there a sufficient regulatory framework and detail in statute that whatever it is that the rule would be addressed will function without the rule existing? Or if something, oh, is there a question?
Yeah, just the question is, do we have this document?
Oh, it's posted under my name under Monday's date.
Under Monday, I'm looking at Mondays right here and I see something under your name, but I haven't, maybe I'm missing it.
Try LCAR memorandum on rulemaking considerations and then scrolling to the third page.
Thank you, got it.
And we also have some of this in our report as well.
I think you link to this in your report.
Yeah.
Did you find it?
Yes.
Should I continue?
Honestly,
In a minute.
feels affirming that we have it in both places. We actually.
While we're asking questions.
Yes, sure.
Anthea, I do have a very vague memory of receiving this memo, but like full disclosure, it's a very vague memory. And I think it just sort of went the way of many other vague memories. What I really appreciate it, and I think it's like incredibly helpful and clear and about what questions need to be asked of the committee when these things are happening. What's less clear to me is who is supposed to remember to do these things. And that in the context of all of our work on this summer committee, that's sort of where I think much of our work falls apart. Because as I said, I have a vague memory of this memo. There are many other memos. There's lots of considerations that are supposed to sort of guide the chairing of a committee. There's no way to maintain all of them simultaneously. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so that's something that LCAR talked about a lot. So one of the things that some of the members of LCAR brought up was this should fall to Ledge Council. Ledge Council should come in and say, here's this flow chart, you need to work through it now. But that might not necessarily be consistent with the goals of the committee. And it's the committee that's really driving the legislative process. And Ledge Council and a flow chart like this, we're really the tools that can be used in helping you do the work that you want to and need to do as the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction or just as the members of the committees of jurisdiction. So I think as this tool hopefully becomes more utilized, it will maybe become a little bit more second nature to maybe say something along the lines of, well, let's think about the flow chart, or maybe the flow chart would be helpful. It also is something that maybe would be useful to be a part of an offline conversation between a member that's looking to move legislation forward that's going to require rulemaking, the chair of a committee that is working on legislation that's going to involve rulemaking, and Ledge Council, so that Ledge Council has a better understanding of whether or not it would be welcome if they were to start talking about the flow chart in committee. This is also something that might be utilized when members are working on legislation prior to it actually being taken up in committee. But I think probably this conversation, if it happens, is going to be a committee conversation when you're kind of getting near to the finalizing the details of what is going into a bill in terms of rulemaking. And in your defense, middle of April was probably not the best timing for a memo of this sort to be sent out. I think everyone knew that. And I think the hope was that it would be something that would get picked up for the 2023 legislative work and not really focused on in the waning weeks of the 2023 session.
Okay, and sorry.
I was just going to add to that, that we did under number 5, if you look at the description, we do talk about legislative council staff helping with this process. And then in 11, we talk about what are the resources necessary to help legislative staff to be able to do that. It may mean more resources, right? So at least we have it noted here, the importance of getting this done.
And so I hear everyone saying, and including you, Anthea, that the intent is that the sort of burden of responsibility of bringing it up sits on legislative council, not on chairs.
I would say that it needs to be the chair directing Ledge Council to utilize this to bring it up, because Ledge Council, like, let's pretend that the chair really doesn't want to talk about these rulemaking considerations at all. They have in their mind, this is the way that we're going to be doing our rulemaking for this particular issue. Or maybe it's like a totally run-of-the-mill use of rulemaking. And I'm going to mention the clean heat standard here. Like, it would have been silly if Ellen had said, we have to talk about the flow chart, when there was this entirely other process that was being contemplated for how rulemaking would be done with the clean heat standard. So I think it's going to need to be like so much. It's a resource, but it's not a one size fit all. This document will be addressing all of the considerations and all of the situations. And Ledge Council will need some guidance before they can assist in the work that's going to be done through a flow chart like this, or not with a flow chart like this, which, maybe if you're just updating rulemaking authority that has existed for years and years, there's no need to have this conversation. You don't need to worry about a timeline because, like with the health benefit, eligibility and enrollment rules, Those get updated on an annual basis because it's linked to federal regulations. You don't need to tell DIVA to do that. You probably would waste your time if you were to talk about a flow chart in the context of that rulemaking. And the chairs that work in those areas probably know that already and will know when it would be useful to have a more in-depth conversation of rulemaking considerations.
I also think we all draw on our own experience in our own committee. And I know for us, the way it will work is in the scheduling meeting with Ledge Council, where we talk ahead of time without the whole committee, and Ledge Council often gives us reminders. Don't forget that you might want to hear from this or that. And I would assume that in the beginning, we're going to be calling Anthea and saying, could you come in and talk to the committee about why this is important and why, how the flow chart works. And sometimes it's just as easy to ask those 3 questions and be able to answer them without probably having to go through the whole flow chart. But
correct. I think sometimes it's going to be more trouble than it's worth if the answers are known sort of going into the rulemaking session law process or what's going to be codified. And I am always happy to talk about this document. I also go to committees quite frequently when they're dealing with rulemaking to talk to them about the rulemaking process in general, which is not an instantaneous process and is a real big undertaking for the administration when rulemaking is required.
And this might be a good place, Anthea, too, for me to just mention, you and I talked a little bit about this on the phone, is that we also have to remember that when we talk about rulemaking, sure, sometimes the rules don't happen on time. And the agency that's been asked to do it has been asked to do, 17 different very big rules all at once. And so we also need to think harder as committees about what we're asking the department, the agency, whoever's writing the rules, to have the staff available to do it within that amount of time. And then the issue comes where, what if you are the staff, for example, you work for the Office of Professional Regulation and you're writing all kinds of new rules, and then you're not going to make a rule that we said they should do, and we didn't add any staff. It's very hard to then come forward and say, we're just not going to get to that. It makes them feel sometimes as state employees like they didn't get their work done, but maybe it would have been really difficult for them to do that. So we need to also make sure as part of the education process that we're talking to committees about the importance of looking at what are we asking our agencies and departments to do, and is it doable? Which is
I was just going to say that is the best segue possible into the middle column, the considerations for establishing rulemaking timeline, because you hit upon so many of the considerations there. The time it takes to complete the process at the absolute fastest, if the rule could be written instantaneously, you're looking at 100 days, 100+ days. And that's just to go through all of the steps with public outreach, the posting requirements, the review periods. In the APA, what regulates rulemaking, from the filing of the initial proposed rule, which comes after the rule has been written, there's been some level of outreach, and the rule has been heard by ICAR. That's the step. So we're jumping in at like the 3rd step in the process, and there are big steps that come before it. From filing of the initial proposed rule until when the rule needs to be adopted, the adopting agency gets 8 months. If it's going to take more than 8 months, they need to ask for an extension from LCAR. So right there, you're looking at a year or so, give or take, for a rule to become a rule. And that's if there is the staffing capacity to do it. Maybe there are other variables there. Maybe they're waiting on a federal regulation. Maybe they're waiting on another state rule with the clean car rules that were piggybacked off of what was done in California. Those couldn't be adopted in Vermont until they had been adopted in California. Other things to think about in terms of if they have the staffing at the start, what happens if there is a decrease in staff capacity? Maybe they think they can do it in 7 months with the staffing they have, but they're not going to be able to do it if there's a decrease in staffing. You mentioned OPR. They had a loss of a significant number of staff in their general counsel arm of their office, and they had some delays with rulemaking this year, and they had to come to LCAR and say, we need to adopt this as an emergency rule again. We just haven't had the staffing capacity to adopt it as a permanent rule. So those are definitely things that need to be considered to have this function under a timeline that is actually reasonable and can be accomplished by the adopting agencies.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry to interrupt. I just think all professionals don't like to come forward and say they weren't able to get the product done. So I just want to make sure that we ask government operations to think about that as they consider what this statute would look like. Thank you. So then there was the third, right?
Yep, the third, and then I just have one more thing to talk about after that, and I hope to finish before Susanna gets here.
Okay.
The final piece is whether or not there are going to be checkbacks required. This is going to be more appropriate if there's a required timeline. It would be sort of odd to say, we're not telling you that you need to do this by a particular time, but we want checkbacks. You also need to consider what's the trigger for requiring a check back. Is it going to be not meeting a deadline? Do you want interim reports? Do you want to see a copy of the rules as they're being developed? That's something that happens commonly. Committees of jurisdiction ask to see the rules when they're pre-filed with ICAR. What is the form of the check back going to be? Do you need something in writing? Is an oral update sufficient? If the written update is based on the fact that they don't have enough staff to adopt the rule as planned, and then you're making them write a report, that's probably something that is going to require staffing capacity that they don't necessarily have. What is the content of the check back? Is it supposed to be something comprehensive? Is it just supposed to be a little check-in note? One of the things that I thought was really valuable in terms of the recommendations that you're working on with Tim, the draft ISAW 3.5, is some of the dialogue process recommendations there, saying, you know, if you're not going to meet a deadline, just letting people know. Maybe that's something that doesn't need to be in session law. And then finally, the last thing on the flow chart, whether something with more quote unquote teeth is necessary, consult with legislative counsel. Some of the things that could be done in law would be like the process that's being done with the clean heat standard and requiring a sort of alternative path to a rule becoming a rule. You could put something in session law that says rules shall be adopted by a particular date. And if you do not adopt it by that particular date, this statute is going to repeal and you no longer have the statutory authority to adopt that rule. That would be something with lots of teeth. You could do something like what was done with and this is front and center with LCAR right now, with the rules on taking coyote with the aid of dogs, where there's a moratorium in place until rules are adopted. And if there needs to be certain requirements that are met in the rules before that moratorium is lifted. So this is some of where having a conversation with legislative counsel about what the goals of the rulemaking are, and if there needs to be something that is sort of deviating from the norm, this would be where that's addressed in the flow chart. The final thing that I just wanted to mention while I am here is that the auditor's office has since issued I want to get the name right, a primer on legislative rulemaking requirements with recommendations. In that report, which is also on your committee page under my name on Monday's date, it included the 3 prior recommendations on pages 10 to 11 and a little summary of what had been done in response to those recommendations. And then the report also makes 3 additional recommendations, which I think will probably be coming up in discussions around rulemaking and government accountability and oversight in the future. The 4th recommendation, so the first of the new recommendations, talks about making the rulemaking database chart available to the public. That is certainly something that could be done very easily. We would just need to ask IT to post it. It's being made available to the public. It's posted on your committee page, but it could easily find a home on LCAR's committee page and just stay there in the sidebar. The other 2 recommendations from the auditor's office are going to require either legislative action or a more in-depth conversation, probably with you, LCAR, the government operations committees. Happy to answer any other questions, but that's what I was hoping to convey to you in the work that you're doing now on your recommendations.
Questions? Okay.
I still feel really nervous about creating systems that rely on the discretion of chairs. As a chair who.
Right. But aren't we saying that Ledge Council, we're relying on Ledge Council to help the chairs?
Yes, but that, but not systemically. And I don't see a solution, so I'm just sort of, I'm not offering a solution. I don't think we should change anything in our recommendations. I just want to voice that discomfort.
Well, just one question is, could it perhaps be a responsibility of the Government Accountability Committee to monitor and keep a register, if you will, of the status of rules in terms of aging or something of that nature, even though Ledge Council may be producing it, that the Accountability Committee would have a responsibility of, in effect, publishing it on a periodic basis, annually or thereafter, so that it gets visibility on the one hand, and that there is a degree of independence in terms of its oversight. And I'm just raising that as a question, as an alternative way of approaching it.
I don't know if we need to publish another thing for no one to look at. But
Make it mandatory that they look at it.
I could see that, if, the newly formed Government Accountability Committee takes one meeting a year to just sort of review that and advise on it.
Okay, let's think about that this afternoon. I've got it written down and we can talk about that. That makes me think of, there are a few little things sprinkled around that are similar to that in our recommendations, so.
I do think it makes sense. I mean, I know one of the reasons we're here is because the previous iteration of the Government Accountability Committee wasn't very functional. And so I do think some explicit agenda items for them helps them to be more functional.
Yes.
So I think that makes a lot of sense to sort of say, this committee shall do these things. Doesn't mean they can't do other things, but they shall do these things.
And we have a section in here where we have some shall do's. So we could add that in when we go back. That sounds good. Okay, Anthea, thank you very much for not only being here today, but also for, flagging me down or making me aware of what you all were doing. As a vice chair, I especially didn't see that last April. And as the reporter of the childcare bill during April, it was a pretty crazy time. So I don't know that I would have looked at it anyhow. So thank you very, very much. It's
You're welcome.
appreciated, and also feels good that we're starting maybe to talk to each other, which is also a big part of what we're doing here. So thank you.
Okay, have a good day and best of luck with the rest of your work and finishing off your report.
Thanks. Okay, so it looks like Susanna, you're here with us. So there she is. Hi. Great to have you. We're pretty much only 4 minutes behind schedule, so welcome. So Susanna Davis is here, and she's going to talk about equitable and inclusive government, which is in that second section of our report, all about, it's just going to, I guess I should have looked this up ahead of time. Section 2A-C of recommendations addressing acts and resolves number in Act 53. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you're muted.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very much. Hi, good morning, everybody. For the record, Susanna Davis, Executive Director of Racial Equity for the state of Vermont. Can you all hear me okay? Is my volume all right? Okay,
Yes.
I'm going to apologize in advance. I am quite ill today, and so I'm going to sound bad and look bad, and I may have to go off camera because I don't want you to see me blowing my nose, but we're going to make it through this. All right.
Sorry about that.
It is a part of life. Thank you, though. I am also pleased to have Jay Green, who is our policy and research analyst. Jay is on the call as well. And I perhaps might periodically invite Jay to come on if there are clarifying questions or if I'm missing anything that needs to be expounded upon. So thanks, Jay, for being here. I also want to just share my apologies with the committee, but particularly with the committee assistant, for making your life a little bit more difficult, I only just sent you my slides that I'm going to be using today. So the committee does not yet have those in hand, but you should have them now for what that's worth. We're also going to be referencing an accompanying document that we've put together for you.
You haven't received, she hasn't received those slides.
Oh, no.
But yeah, she will post them as soon as she does receive them.
Okay, it was mere seconds ago, so
Okay,
they might still be in the outbox. And they're in the ether.
okay.
So we will also be referencing an accompanying document that we've put together that is a fuller, much more detailed version of today's slides, and we'll make sure that you have that as well. And I guess I'll go ahead and begin. I know that we have a pretty large amount of time together today, so I'm gonna take that as permission to go at a relaxed pace instead of my usual rushing, and I encourage the committee to stop me with questions, thoughts, remarks, or any clarifications needed along the way. And finally, I shall attempt a screen share if that's okay with you. All right.
Yeah, there you go.
Can you all see my slide? Oh, you can, because I can see your video and you can see it. Okay, great. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the charges 2 through 4 that the summer, I'll call it the SGAC affectionately, the Summer Government Accountability Committee has been tasked with. A lot of what I talk about today, you may already have heard us or someone else say, but it's important to us that this discussion be part of this committee's record and that we just have a shared understanding of some of the considerations that we should be making when thinking about how to approach state board service and the next phase of it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Office of Racial Equity, how it views the principles of equity, in particular, what is the vision and what are the values from which we approach our work. Then I will go in depth into the recommendations we have regarding charges 2 through 4 of this committee's work. And then I'll follow up with just 3 other small additional considerations for you all to think about. And of course, I am happy to have any other follow-up discussion or hear the committee's thoughts after all of that and during all of that. So first, this is something you've already seen before, of course. This is an excerpt from Act 53 that dissolved the GAC and created the SGAC, Summer Government Accountability Committee. These are the 4 charges with which you all have been tasked to address. Our office really is going to focus more on 2 through 4 because those speak directly to issues of equity and inclusion, or they're related to things that we have previously opined on in reports. So of course, those are equitable pay for boards and commissions. I'll call them work groups collectively. Equitable participation on work groups, and figuring out how to control and manage the number of work groups we're working on or working through. So you all may recall that our office submitted a letter of testimony last month about this. It was a little bit of a whirlwind for us because we had only recently discovered the existence of the SGAC and the short runway that this committee had been provided in order to meet its mandate. So we had a lot of concern about process equity in particular. We see that as not just an important part of government work in general, but in particular, it seemed that the subject matter you all would be dealing with necessarily required a degree of process equity that we weren't seeing in the process. I was grateful to have several conversations with Chair Brumstead and to come into the committee's last meeting just to touch base a little bit about this. And so what you saw in our previous letter of testimony were a few suggestions. The first one being, let's slow this down a bit. The second one being, please continue to engage our office. We've got lots of things to say about this, and we really, really need to make sure that you hear them. The third was engage the community. And in particular, we named a couple of other work groups that do exist that our state created that have been looking at the issues that you all are supposed to be deliberating on, specifically per diem compensation. And then, of course, we provided a couple of examples of useful tools for you all to approach this work. One of which is I'm not going to say the acronym because I won't be able to flesh it out, but it's a toolkit for centering equity through a data governance situation. And the other one talked about the spectrum of participation. We'll reference both of those today in the presentation. So first, let's begin a little bit with vision and values. It's really important to us as an office that we begin with this, not because we want to be cute and euphemistic, but because oftentimes in the public's view, government tends not to be mission driven. It tends to be very task oriented and very deliverables driven. And if we're really talking about transforming the way that government operates, that it's important that we understand the why. So this is the vision that the Office of Racial Equity approaches its work from. We envision a Vermont that is threefold. First, that all state employees and contractors are treated equitably throughout their tenure. So anyone who works for, with, or through the state of Vermont is being treated fairly and is equitably represented in decision-making and in leadership. That's important. The next is that all members of the public are receiving fair and appropriate treatment and services. So not just how we treat our folks internally, but also how we're treating members of the public when we deliver services. And the third part of that vision is that the state is using systems that make those first two things autopilot. In other words, it's often the case that we'll say, we've noticed a disparity. Let's make this minor tweak one time to correct it. When in reality, what we need to do is look at the system that generated the disparity in the first place. For example, we might notice that we have an underrepresentation of Asian American Pacific Islanders in a particular agency. And a subpar solution to that will be, well, let's just hire 9 more Asian people. Boom, done, next problem. When in reality, what we need to do is look at our screening processes on the front end and say, are we screening people out specifically from this demographic group? Let's not just make that tiny tweak, and instead let's really look at the systems that created this problem in the first place. So that's what that third part of the vision is about. Next is a set of values. Now we operate from a very long set of values, but these are the 3 that we find ourselves coming back to every single day. The first being process equity. This is one we're going to talk a lot about today. When I say process equity, what I mean is oftentimes when people talk about accomplishing equity, they're just thinking of everybody ending up kind of in the same place, right? It's very outcomes oriented. And there's nothing wrong with an outcomes oriented approach, but we want to make sure that we're also lifting up process equity, which means it's not just that we arrive at the correct conclusion, but that we got there along the way in a way that was inclusive and that was fair. This is one of the ways in which government can demonstrate a shift away from paternalism by not just saying, we've made decisions on your behalf because it's best for you, here's the result, but rather making sure that people are invited and participating in shaping their own futures. So process equity is a really big one for us. The next one is structural solutions for structural problems, not individual solutions for structural problems. This is another really big one. Oftentimes when we talk about people from communities who've been historically oppressed or marginalized, those groups are often told, well, if you want to get out of the situation you're in, here are a bunch of individual solutions for you personally to take up. For example, poverty. Poverty is a systemic issue. Oftentimes people talk about poor people using language like less fortunate, but the socioeconomic system in this country has nothing to do with fortune or fate or chance or destiny, right? It's deliberate. It's a system that's longstanding and that's designed to privilege some and disadvantage others. And so it's a structural problem. And yet, so many of the solutions that we propose for something like poverty often involve making specific behavioral or lifestyle changes from people experiencing poverty. Well, why do you have nice clothes? Why do you have the latest iPhone? Well, you shouldn't live in that neighborhood. Why did you go out to eat last night, right? These are all things that can sure be tweaked at the individual level, but don't actually really account for the broader forces that are designed to keep some folks impoverished. So when we talk about structural solutions, we're really talking about the broader set of things that need to happen in order for wider problems to be addressed. There's an analogy that I like to use. I'll say it quickly. It would be as if all the lights in the State House suddenly went off. Let's pretend it's dark outside. An individual solution would be for the sergeant at arms to announce, okay, everybody, you've got to have your own headlamps and flashlights, whip out your cell phones and light your own way. That's an individual solution to a structural problem. The structural solution would be let's get the lights back on. Let's pay that bill or whatever it is. The third and last value on this list is transformative change over transactional change. You could also state that as adaptive change over technical change. And what that means really goes back to the previous example we gave. You don't want to just make small tweaks to make an individual problem go away if we're not really transforming the system that got us that problem in the first place. So don't just say we're going to hire, 10 more of XYZ demographic. Rather, let's look at why XYZ demographic tends to be screened out of our hiring processes in the first place. So again, the vision and the values are really important for us to lead with, because not only do they guide all the work that we do, but they offer insight into why we recommend and push for the things that we do in other sectors of government. I'll pause here for questions before going to charge number 2.
It's like we're all set.
Great. So charge number 2, as you all know, is equity in pay. Specifically, I guess I'll read from the bill language: ways to ensure equity in pay across commissions, boards, and joint legislative committees based on the nature of service and required skill level. All right. So again, there's a longer document that we're going to be providing you that fleshes this out in much more detail. But I just wanted to highlight a few of the issues that we've noticed or have been told about when it comes to the current structure of compensation for work group service. So one of the things that we note is that in order for any person to receive per diem compensation for sitting on a board or a commission, that person first and foremost has to submit to the state an IRS form W-9. This is a federal form. It's a tax form that confirms that the person is authorized to receive payments in the United States, and the person can, not that the person can work, that's an I-9, but that the person, basically, it's the proof that we require that we can pay this person. One of the issues with that is that we have folks who, for a good reason, are either very hesitant due to privacy or safety concerns to be able to provide a W-9, or there are some folks who simply can't provide one. Maybe they have legal issues like immigration status, where they're not actually authorized to be receiving payments from a state entity in the state or in the US. Another issue that we've noted is that, generally speaking, the protocol is that members of working groups submit their per diem payment requests through paperwork at the end, after every meeting that they attend. That's generally the protocol if everyone's on their P's and Q's, so to speak. It's what I have found in my experience is often that people will just sort of do them in batches. Apologize, need to make space for a coughing fit. Please.
We received the slides and I'm working on posting.
So generally speaking, that creates an administrative burden for work group members to submit that paperwork routinely at the end of every meeting, particularly if it's a very active work group that's having frequent meetings. It also creates high administrative burden for the state staff who process those payments. So sorry, coming back to you. I apologize for these frequent interruptions. I was doing so well before this hearing.
You have so much talking to do. Feel free to cough a little bit up for us. It's okay. If you were in the room, you would. So, I feel bad.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry.
I'm coughing, you should too.
Yeah, right. Senator Brock is coughing, so he says you should too.
Okay. Thank you, Senator, for the solidarity. Okay. So administrative burden, not just for payees, but also for the staff who have to process all of those requests. I'll give you one example. One of the work groups that I sit on is the Health Equity Advisory Commission, which is 31 members strong. We meet generally monthly, but leading up to a report, we may be meeting twice a month, which means theoretically, if everyone's putting in their per diem requests, we could be processing, I don't know, 50-ish every month. Of course, because not everybody gets a per diem payment, so whatever. So that's a lot. Another thing that we've noticed is, and this is kind of what we've heard from a lot of different people on different work groups, is that the per diem rate is generally too low. Generally, it's set, as you all know, at $50 a meeting. I think for meetings up to 4 hours. But we do know that sometimes they vary between different work groups. And so I know that there is a separate committee that works on that in the legislature. And so sometimes what that means is that work group participation is discouraged because people can't necessarily afford to give that much time to doing serious state level policy work for that level of compensation. It also creates the perception that some work is valued more highly than other work, which can create resentment and also can cheapen the collective view of some topic areas over others. For example, if you're sitting on a working group that may be, I don't know, healthcare related, and your per diems are, I don't know, $125 a meeting, versus if you're on a working group having to do with, let's say, I don't know, education or criminal justice, and your per diem is the standard rate of $50, the public perception may be skewed in a way that treats healthcare as somehow more valuable, more lucrative, or that the policy analysis or input on that topic is more highly valued than it would be in the education or criminal justice space. So some of the recommendations that we have around this include allowing for alternate forms of compensation so that people can receive recompense for their work without necessarily having to just be in dollars. This might mean things like stipends for childcare or actually providing on-site childcare at meetings or events. It might mean things like fuel compensation or reimbursements. One of the things that we did in 2020 when we administered the Economic Stimulus Equity Fund was we provided state level funds for people who had been excluded from CARES Act funding, from CARES Act stimulus payments due to their or someone else's immigration status. And in order to avoid being punished by the federal government for taking care of all Vermonters, we use state level funds and we
So this is like a slightly aside, but I was like having a deep financial stress moment. And then I realized that I have gone to 2 conferences this fall and had not received my reimbursement back from either of those 2 conferences. And that for all of these things, there's sort of an expectation of like floating thousands of dollars, which is a little bit different from, the day-to-day of missing out on a day of paid work and getting $100 for it. But even that is, it's just, there are like the number of structural barriers that people consider normal to all of this is really remarkable.
Agreed. I didn't even know you could submit for being a conference, so interesting.
You have to get pre-approved.
Okay.
And this is actually the conferences paying me back, not
Right.
the legislature, but.
I actually really appreciate both of those points because I think that that's also a really common factor is that sometimes it requires an upfront cost to be able to participate in some of these activities. And per diems are often seen as, or they effectively become reimbursements. So that may also dampen people's ability to participate on working groups. And then again, to the point about not knowing whether one could submit for reimbursement for certain activities, I think is also another point that for a lot of people in the public, government service feels opaque because they don't necessarily know the protocols or all of the ways in which they could make sure that they're made whole. So providing for forms, I'm sorry, so what I was saying.
I'm just gonna jump in. Sorry, just one more thing in case anyone's watching this, you can in fact get an advance. There's just a procedure for it, which I think most people also don't know. So while we're making sort of things that maybe people didn't know for their service, that seems like another useful piece of information. Sorry to jump in.
No, please, thank you for that. I actually didn't know that, so.
Yeah.
We're all
And
learning.
And that's true for all state employees, not just the legislators.
so it would seem in that list of improvements, we might want to add education of the systems that are allowable, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's going to be a really big piece.
Yeah.
So what we did with the Economic Stimulus Equity Fund was we took state level dollars and provided them to a trusted partner in Vermont who could administer those funds. Those were done for people who were banked and who could provide W-9s and take checks. We gave them a check. For those who could not, we were able to find alternative ways to make sure that they were able to receive a stimulus payment that was commensurate with what other people in the country and in the state were getting at that time. And it really was in the vein of equity, right? Every person in Vermont was going through the same thing. And we didn't think that immigration status should be something that makes the difference between whether a member of your household can be supported or not. So that was one of the things that allowed us that creativity. And there were a lot of people who were very nervous about it. Oh, we're scared of the auditor. Oh, we're scared of the federal government. Oh, we're scared of ICE. And oftentimes those kinds of fears are enough to make an entity not even try. So Vermont definitely made a splash both in the state and nationally for that. And that's one of the things that our office is probably most proud of so far in our tenure. Another suggestion for improvement that we have is to confirm when we create a new work group that's going to have a per diem payment structure, make sure that the supporting agency actually can handle the workload that it's going to take in order to be able to process those per diems. If they cannot, then perhaps another thing that we can think about is to redesign the way in which per diems are handled. Maybe that means there's a portal where people can just submit them a little bit more easily than the Excel form that we tend to give out to people, or the photocopied form that they have to fill out and awkwardly try to sign online by dragging a mouse in a way that makes your signature look cartoonish and like a 3-year-old did it. So those are some of the things that can help to reduce that bureaucratic burden, both for the payees and also for the staff. And then, of course, redesigning the per diem payment structure in a way that feels less opaque, in a way that properly compensates people for what they're being asked to do, and in a way that allows people to really feel like what they're putting into it is worth the effort. Because oftentimes what it means is that people who don't need the money are the ones who can participate on working groups, or people who are just willing to wait, or who just are in it for love of the game and not necessarily for the compensation, are the ones who can participate. And that's how you end up with the same faces on so many different boards and commissions.
Before you switch off this slide, I just wanted to mention to everyone that the slides are now on our Lindsay received them and has posted them. And the second thing is, this is a wonderful chart for this number 2. I really appreciate your doing this. This helps so much for me to be able to see, problems, what could we do? It's really important. So thank you.
Thank you. We love charts. We'll make you a lot. All right. Here are a few other considerations. Number one, this is perhaps more of a philosophical question, but what exactly are we paying people for? I note that the current per diem rate was set before everything switched to online and hybrid style. And so a lot of people really were going around the state for in-person meetings. I myself remember gatherings of the Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Systems Advisory Panel, affectionately referred to as the RDAP, at Vermont Law School, where the then director of Fair and Impartial Policing used to come with a stack of pizzas, and everybody would kind of be crammed into a classroom in a lecture hall or something, and we'd do our work and leave. Was it that we were covering people's mileage? Was it that we were covering the time that they were spending? Was it fuel? Was it expertise? Because now a lot of meetings take place virtual. And so the idea of what we were compensating for comes into question. Was it for the logistical needs related to participation, or was it the actual participation? What is the value of those dollars today? And are we asking the same thing of everybody on that group? For example, if you're the chairperson of a group versus if you are a regular member of the group. Is it a small 4-person group, or is it a 22-member group where work can perhaps be distributed over a broader group of people? So I think we have to come to a shared understanding about what exactly are we paying people for, and that might help us determine the value and the appropriateness of what it is that we're compensating people for. Also, what is the real commitment that we're asking for? Sometimes there are hidden costs and hidden tasks that are associated with being a member of a work group. Sometimes some can get away with just sort of showing up at the meetings, being there for the attendance. Sometimes you give some input during the deliberations, and then maybe there's staff members from the supporting agency who might be writing the report on the group's behalf. But in other cases, I think perhaps more often, you'll find that the group members themselves are doing research, they're drafting reports, perhaps they're doing event planning, testimony afterwards to the legislature, and a lot of other behind the scenes labor. And so membership on a work group that's state created looks very different in different spaces. And so making sure that people really understand what's being asked of them. And I also just want to note here, that's not an easy task for any of us to do, because a person's role on a work group may change over time. For example, you might be really involved on the front end. You might be on 2 subcommittees of the working group and you help draft the report, and then you take a step back. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, now we should pay you less because now you're less active. I don't really know that there's a quick or easy answer for it. But I think helping people understand a little bit more clearly what is it that's really being asked of them, what's the commitment? And I think in that way, we'll perhaps see more steady participation and less churn. The next consideration is which work groups do get paid more than the $50 and why. Our office is not aware of a central guidance document that lists out the process for determining higher per diem rates. I do concede that it's possible that this exists and we just don't know where to find it. But if that's the case, then perhaps others also don't know where to find it. And it might be the kind of thing that we'd want to fold into that education piece about making sure that there's more transparency in how this process gets determined on a group by group basis. And then how many analogous groups already exist? So one of the things that is tricky is that sometimes we're offering per diems to members of 3 different working groups, and they're all kind of deliberating on the same thing. So it's odd. It feels as if we're duplicating, we're creating redundancies in the ways in which we're funding groups. So everyone is kind of getting paid too little, but they're all doing the same work that probably doesn't need to be replicated across those multiple groups. So thinking about whether we're duplicating efforts by creating parallel groups that don't necessarily need to be separate. I'll come back to that point a little bit later because that is charge number 4. Let's move to charge 3, which is equitable participation. And again, I'm going to go right back to that bill language because I want to get it right. Ways to ensure equitable participation on boards and commissions and in any public engagement process mandated by the state or the legislature by providing appropriate compensation and material support. All right. So what you're looking at right now is the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. This is a graphic that was put together by a group called Facilitating Power. You cannot read it clearly. I will zoom it in for you. So what this shows us is a spectrum of ways in which community can be engaged and the level of effectiveness / meaningfulness that each of those stages of the spectrum provides. So on the far left, we'll see stage 0. That's ignore. This is effectively where we're making decisions on people's behalf and completely not including them, not talking to them, not engaging them. The impact of that really is marginalization. And the message that we're sending to the community when we do that is we're not interested in your voice or your needs or your interests. We're going to do what we're going to do. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, number 5, that's defer to. The impact of that really is a shared sense of community ownership. And the message that we give when we go that route is we want to make sure that communities feel like they have collective power and capacity to create solutions with us and for themselves. So everything in between, again, represents that spectrum. This is one of the 2 items that we referenced in our original letter of testimony. So you'll find a link to this resource both in that first letter and also in the follow-up document that we'll be providing. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about number 2 here. Where's my fancy laser pointer? Here you go. I want to talk a little bit about spectrum level 2, consult. This is considered the most common form of quote unquote community engagement. It's the one that I see most represented in state government processes and activities. And I want to quote from the source itself that says that the most common form of community engagement among mainstream institutions is consultation, usually in the form of semi-interactive meetings in which members of the community have the chance to offer input into pre-baked plans. They go on to say that the biggest critique of this form of engagement is that decisions are often already made and that community input is simply there to serve to check a box. Now, this is something that we've heard a lot in Vermont as well, both from members of the public and from members of work group who've expressed frustration at not feeling like they're able to really connect with the community. So I think that this chart is something that really deserves a deeper look by this committee. I won't spend too much time on it right now. There are other versions of this or sort of analogous concepts. For example, you may have heard of the ladder of participation. It's another really similar way of looking at this. Some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves, and I want to go back actually, because this really talks about community engagement. I know that you all are thinking specifically about membership on working groups, which is a little bit different than community engagement, but actually it's not, because equitable membership and inclusive membership on our working groups means that, number one, we've got to do community engagement right in order to solicit those members, number one. It also means that equitable participation with working groups doesn't always mean membership on those working groups. And so community engagement, outreach, that kind of thing really should be seen as inextricably linked to getting that broader, more diverse perspectives with working groups. So with that said, here are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves in thinking about equitable participation with our state-created work groups. Number one, is what we're doing performative? When we say we're doing engagement or outreach, are we really meaningfully including people in decision-making? If we do it, how likely is it that their feedback is actually going to be shaping the final outcome? And one of the ways that you can tell, one of the telltale signs is at what point in a work group's process is community input sought? If it's early and often, then you have a much more a much higher chance that that community input is going to be meaningfully incorporated into the final product. If it's kind of a last minute check the box exercise at the end, then that signals to us that ideas and decisions and recommendations are probably already fully baked, and that this is just seen as a tokenistic performative activity. Also to consider whether the involvement of people is, what's the purpose of us asking them to be present? For example, do we want a person who has lived experience to sit on a working group because they've experienced a certain form of trauma or pain? And is their role to sit there and regurgitate and perform and relive that pain for the consumption of the rest of the members of the work group? We don't want to reduce people just to their identities or just to their experience or just to the worst thing that they've ever done or the worst thing that someone's ever done to them. And so thinking about why we're setting up our working groups to have the membership list that they have is also really important. And then when you do have people who have experienced some form of pain, harm, or trauma, how can the working group be supportive in the moment? I think that one of the simple ways to do that is that there should be some sort of central guidance on central guidance for working groups, or for at the very least working group chairs, on how to respond in real time to discussions of pain, harm, or trauma. And in the same way, I know that legislators get sort of new legislator orientation, and then there's also chairperson orientations. There could certainly be value in having chairperson orientations for those who head up work groups. The next consideration is who gets to count as part of Vermont's communities. In this state, we know that, and in a lot of places, we know that there tends to be bias against people who are new residents. Evidently, you can't have an opinion unless you've lived here for a certain minimum amount of time because you know nothing. Younger residents, youth, are often seen as either not being able, it's often assumed that they can't be taken seriously, or that they're not at a cognitive level that they can keep up with conversations in working groups. Or perhaps we say, well, you know, they just have school schedules and it's hard to plan around that, so never mind. And, you know, these are the folks who are going to have to live the longest with the decisions that we're making. Oftentimes, people who are immigrants, who are undocumented perhaps, are not reached out to, are not solicited for inclusion on our state-created work groups. Oftentimes, people who are state affiliated are not considered members of the community. And I know it's a tricky situation, right? I mean, there tends to be this false dichotomy that's created in discussions when people talk about state people and community people, as if state people all sleep in the supply closet at night and don't go home to communities, right? And while we all perhaps have our own little napping corners hidden away in the office buildings that we work in, generally speaking, we all tend to go home to a community. And so the idea that if you have an affiliation with the state in some way, that makes you no longer a person who has a viable and valuable input, then I think that really reduces our ability to hear from a broad segment of people, particularly because the state is, depending on who you ask, the largest employer in the state. And so we're really cutting out a large swath of people if that's the approach that we take. People who are poorer are often not considered to be part of Vermont's communities or eligible to sit on working groups. People who live in really rural areas. And sometimes that one can happen in insidious ways. Oftentimes it's just billed as, oh, it's a logistical hurdle. How are you going to make it to the meetings? We'll do you a favor and not ask you to do such a big lift by just not even inviting you to be on the work group at all, because it would be a long drive for you. You're welcome. And what we're really doing is excluding people from participation simply because we don't want to go through the extra effort of figuring out how to make the logistics work in a way that's more equitable. People who live with disabilities. Sometimes it might mean, hey, you know what? You've got to make sure that all of the meetings take place with an in-person location that has access to ramps and 42-inch wide doorways, right? This is basic stuff. This is basic Americans with Disability Act stuff. And yet, sometimes when these questions or accommodations are raised, They're often treated as inconveniences. And what that does is it signals to people living with disabilities that their involvement is A, more of a check the box exercise, or B, just generally inconvenient to the group at large, which discourages participation broadly from the community. So thinking about who gets to be considered part of Vermont's communities is a really important piece to this, because it's going to be limiting our choices for who exactly gets to participate on our working groups. I find that whenever we look at the people of color on a lot of the state created bodies, it's the same 12 people. And we know it's the same because we're all, at this point, we all refer to them by just their first name. Susanna, Eitan, Mark, Curtis. We know, you know who I'm talking about because it's just a handful of people all the time. And it's not that this isn't a group that's passionate and that wants to be involved, but there's tens of thousands of people of color in Vermont. I know we can find more people who are not just able to, but also eager to get involved. And sometimes, again, it has to do with the feeling of not being welcomed. Sometimes it has to do with the sense of opacity. I don't know how government works. I don't know how to get on a board or commission. And sometimes we just need to be able to make a connection with people. Next, I want us to think about who routinely gets left out of the conversation. I touched on this a little bit, but we tend to focus our attention when we solicit for new members of working groups. We tend to focus our attention on people who don't need interpreters, for example, or who don't need accommodations for physical accessibility, or for people who don't necessarily need plain language documents or other things that would assist their ability to participate. So again, we're narrowing our options and reducing the number and the breadth and the expertise of people we're able to include on our working groups because we tend to do our outreach in one language or in certain areas or what have you. I'm thinking of one work group in particular that has been closely linked to our office for 4 years since we started. And when it was created, the members of that working group came from pretty much all the regions of the state. And over time, you know, term limits end, people step off, they rotate off. We're now at the point where 80% of the members all come from the same town. Oops. And so what starts out as a group that appears to have regional diversity can over time end up morphing into a group that is very, very concentrated in one area of the state in terms of its membership if we're not cautious and continually considering how we do reappointments and how we do replacements when the working group membership evolves. The next one is, do we really need a new work group to have meaningful community input? So again, I'm going to go back to what we talked about with this chart. I know that community engagement is not always the same as having community members on a working group. And I would argue that you don't always need a new work group or more positions on a work group in order to do proper, meaningful, deep, and empowering community engagement. There are absolutely ways that we can maintain not just temporary, but long-standing and fruitful relationships with our community partners without having to saddle them with the additional burden of being members of regular working groups. The flip side of that, of course, is that you also want to make sure that if it's a situation where, for example, people are voting, you don't want to take away people's ability to have a voting seat on a group, right? Because sometimes just having people there as community consultants can end up feeling empowering just because of their mere presence in the room. But it can simultaneously be disempowering if they're routinely denied the ability to do something like vote. And then, of course, the last one I've listed here is how are communities being being encouraged to engage proactively with our work groups and not just when they're appointed or when they're invited to a space. So again, I know that you all probably are familiar with this because of your work in the legislature, but oftentimes people get invited to come in and testify to you all on issues that are affecting people across the state. But there are a lot of people who have input and who would come and who would give meaningful input on topics if only they knew how. And so it's not just about when is this working group taking up the particular topic of interest and are they inviting the right people, but rather if there's a working group that is relevant and so a member of the public wants to engage with them on a topic that's within their wheelhouse, how do we make sure that they know how to do that proactively? So I think that, again, that goes back to the education piece. It also goes back to general protocols. How do different working groups handle public communication? And it really just runs the gamut. For example, working groups on which I sit, if I tend to be the one who's leading, chairing, or facilitating meetings, then generally it's a practice of mine that public comment take place both at the beginning and the end of the meeting. At the beginning, of course, because sometimes people just want to get in, say what they got to say, and leave without having to stay for the entire meeting. And again, at the end, because sometimes people want to comment on the thing that you're deliberating over the course of that meeting. And so providing two opportunities makes it so that people have that flexibility. The thing about that, of course, is that that's a matter of timing and planning. And that can be difficult sometimes in managing meetings. But allowing for people to be able to engage with working groups in ways that work for them could be the difference between the working group feeling like no one cares about their work versus really getting meaningful input. Now, sometimes that might mean let's have that meeting at 6:30 p.m. instead of 10:30 a.m. because people have jobs. And so really thinking about the ways in which working groups operate, the protocols that they use, and the ways in which they communicate or engage with the public, those can be make or break in terms of how and whether the public is heard.
Does it, before she switches to charge 4, does anyone have a question? I actually have a question about that last slide.
Mhm.
The top one, are we tokenizing people by inviting them to share pain, trauma for the sake of it? Sometimes I'm concerned that in our committees, we ask people to come in to testify based on some experience. And then they share the experience, you know, that the committee is crying or what, you know, you get a real experience. And then do we over decide based on this one experience that really impacted all of us and because of our emotions? And so when you say for the sake of it, you're referring more to being part of the whole committee every day, day in and day out, don't use it for that. Is that right? But not as a testifying, it's really important that we have people come in. We have to have all sides of a topic and we have to make sure that we hear from everyone. I'm just curious sort of what your thoughts are on all of what I just put out there.
Absolutely. So I did have trouble wording this. And what I meant when I wrote for the sake of it is sometimes people just want to hear about other people's harm or experiences or trauma just so that they can take in salacious stories and say, wow, right? It does something to the consumer of other people's pain to witness other people's pain comfortably knowing that they didn't experience it. And so you know, I'm thinking, for example, let's say that we had a hypothetical. I'm making this up, so I'm not referencing any groups in particular. But let's say we had a hypothetical working group on victims of assault crimes. I don't know, and maybe one of the, you know, maybe the working group roster is one member from state's attorneys, one member from the civil rights unit, one member from the HRC, a survivor of domestic or sexual violence, a person from the ORE, right? That survivor of domestic violence is being included specifically because someone did something awful to them, right? And so the presumption there is that the reason you're there is because of this traumatic experience that you had. Sometimes that person is expected to share it. Sometimes that person wants to share it voluntarily. But if that's the only thing that we're reducing them to, because that person who's a survivor of domestic or sexual violence, that person could also be an attorney or a community leader. That person could also be an expert on statutory interpretation, right? There's a lot of other dimensions to a person. But if we're reducing them to a particular niche based on historical pain or trauma, then what we're doing effectively is zooming them too far in, almost like typecasting them. And then at that point, what we expect from them is that all of their input is given solely from the lens of, I'm a survivor of this thing, or I'm a person with melanin, or I'm a person who is, you know, a quadriplegic or what have you. And in reality, people are able to be contributors from more lenses than just that one. So that's kind of what I meant by that. I do take your point about sometimes being impacted by witness testimony and perhaps weighting that a lot heavier because of the impact it had on you. And I think that that's another reason why it's so important to get also a broader number of inputs, of testimony, whether it's written or otherwise, so that you can have a really well-rounded set of inputs, and not be unduly weighting some over others.
Yeah, and I understand. What's hard is, as legislator, putting together a committee where we don't seek out people that have had experience in certain things also makes it seem like we forgot them and they're the ones that the work is about. And I get what you're saying, though. I'm a legislator who comes from a family of alcoholism, very, you know, when I was a child. And so when I'm asked to be on a committee, I'm often asked to fit the legislator. Oh, we've got a legislator, check that box. But yet when I'm there and I share my experience, that becomes really important to the group because that's not what they expected. But it's really hard to know if you're hitting what's not expected because you don't know that they're there. So that I just bring that up because I really like all that you're saying here. And I think it's so important. And these are the things that, at least for me as a legislator, I struggle with in the committee room when we try and figure it out. And then lastly, I would say that as the child working really hard on the child care bill, the speaker and the president pro tem came to me and said, can you recommend people for the implementation committee for the pre-K program? And I had a list of names and none of them could participate. And they all wanted to. A couple of them actually said yes, went to the first meeting and they told them it was going to take 6 to 8 hours a month. And they pulled themselves out. So, and I know that that's because maybe we didn't make that committee available enough to folks. And part of that is because of the commissioners and the secretaries who are on that committee too, who are important to be facilitating that committee as part of their job, don't end up. So these are all, I'm not saying really asking a question. I'm just saying, boy, there are a lot of issues once you start, peeling back.
Yeah, you're right. And I really appreciate the example you gave of yourself, because it's like you said, you're there and you're going to check the legislator box without people knowing that you have this whole other body of experience. And I think that's really what we want to unlock. And so one of the things that I would recommend, and I think I said it in passing here in this deck, perhaps not really explicitly, is to find alternative ways to get the same people without reducing them to certain kinds of identity, right? So for example, you might say, oh, you want to make sure, we know that statistically speaking, let's think about women's equal pay, right? We know that at different times in the year is equal pay day for different demographic groups. That is to say, if a woman and a man both started working on January 1st of this year, for the woman to earn what the man has earned by December 31st, it would take her until December 31st, plus a certain amount of time into the next year to make the same salary, or rather income. And that's actually different based on different women's demographic groups. So for all women, it tends to hover around March. For Asian women, it tends to hover around March. For Black women, it's August. Indigenous women, it's October, I think. Latina women is around November. So it would take, for example, statistically speaking, I am Latina. It would take me a full year plus until November of the next year, statistically speaking, to earn the same income as a white man who started work January 1st with me the previous year. Long explanation. Why did I start that? Women's equal pay. Oh dear.
Just who to put on the committees and whether or not you were talking, because we were talking about how you get people with a broader
proxies. Yes, thank you. So if we know that statistically speaking, Latina women tend to be massively underpaid compared to averages, then it might, if we're doing a committee based about, I don't know, income inequality, we might say, make sure you throw a Latina on there. We're going to put that as, you know, someone in the roster because we're presuming that that person fits a demographic group that has experienced a certain kind of harm. When in reality, you don't know. Like, yeah, okay, fine, I'm part of that demographic group, but I may not be at the next year, November mark, right? Because there's a lot of stratification within our groups. It reminds me of a phrase that is common in the Black community, not all skin folk or kinfolk. And I think a lot of times, and of course, what that means is that just because you're a member of a particular demographic group doesn't mean that you operate with that group's ideals, values, or best interests in mind. And so sometimes we bring people on based on their identities, but it doesn't actually mean that they're going to use that they're going to come with that lens. All of us are capable of perpetuating harm, even against our own demographic groups. And sometimes we end up bringing people on who we think are going to bring a particular perspective, who end up not. They may be very adherent to the status quo. I will say that I had to write down the things that you were talking about because I didn't want to forget them. So I think there's a way that we can include other proxies to account for this, right? So instead of saying at least one person from the Black community, at least one person who's Blah, at least one person who's under, you know, 16. It might be something like, you know, a person who has a particular set of experiences. Maybe a person who's like, we do this a lot with the foster care system, right? Someone who's aged out of the system or something like that. So I don't know, it's tricky, but I think we can think creatively about how to get some of the same folks without necessarily going by certain identities. The other thing is your point about having a list of potential work group members who wanted to participate but who couldn't. That hurts a lot. We have been asked to appoint people or designate people to different working groups. And I have so many great community members who have often told me, yeah, I'd love to, but I can't. Or, oh, I'd love to, but that group meets in Burlington and I live in, you know, I don't know, Springfield.
Windsor.
Right.
One of them was Windsor.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's very painful too, because at that point, it's not even about trying to find willingness to be civically engaged. It's just about the logistics or other hurdles serving as barriers. And so that's one of the reasons that we often recommend things like meeting outside of typical business calendars. You know, think about evening meetings, think about weekend meetings, consider the cultural calendar. We often will plan events with consideration of what other observances are happening at the time. If I'm doing something on a Friday evening or a Saturday evening, I may have people from different religious groups who may not be able to participate. So I think us being able to make those kinds of considerations also could help.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Should run a workshop for legislators on all of this.
I would love to do that. All right.
Well, I think one of the things that is important for us to talk about is how do you recruit people for boards and commissions generally? Because regardless of any selectivity bias that may or may not exist, the problem is we don't have enough people who are willing to serve, who want to serve, or who are aware of serving, and that's throughout the entire demographic in the state. And as a result, the people who get appointed to boards and commissions are the people who volunteer to be appointed for boards and commissions, and there still are vacancies after that occurs. And that is a concern. The second concern is that we tend to attract people to boards and commissions, particularly certain boards and commissions, based on special interests. That people have a particular goal, personally, economically, politically, to serve in those positions, as opposed to the focus on doing the work that perhaps needs to be done in an impartial way. Part of that, though, is frankly, I think, driven by the lack of folks who are willing to serve, so that there is the possibility even to achieve both balance and obviously some selectivity based on qualifications. Those are, I think, are real problems, at least that I see in the whole boards and commissions situation that we have in Vermont today. I'd be interested whether or not you see any of those same things.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that is behind the unwillingness of a lot of people is, again, the compensation structure is one piece of it. Another thing, again, like we talked about, sometimes it's the logistics. Sometimes it's saying, well, you know, public meeting law requires that this meeting take place in person. So if you can't make that, then you're out of luck. You can't be on this board. Or again, it may be other barriers to participation that are impacting people. I will say that I don't think that we categorically have a lack of people who want to participate, but I think there is something that you did say in there that I strongly agree with, which is lack of awareness of service. There are a lot of people who I think would serve if they knew what was available out there. They may only hear about maybe 5 or 6 different state committees, but as you all know, there are hundreds, right? And all of them are, not all of them, but many of them are consistently in search of members or just input in general. I also think that you're correct that a lot of times service really is willingness to serve is driven by interest or by personal passion for a topic. And, you know, one of the things, again, this is a little bit trickier to accomplish, but I think it's so doable and so worth it, is for us to be able to clearly outline for people how this is all interconnected and how the work applies. For example, one of the things that we talk about when it comes to, justice reinvestment, for example, has to do with recidivism. Well, you can't talk about recidivism without talking about housing insecurity and housing instability. Someone who's really passionate about housing may not recognize that there is a connection there with the justice system or vice versa, but there is. And I think that if we as government are able to do a better job of explaining to people in recruitment, not just why this narrow subject matter affects them, but also how it also touches on other points in their lives that affect them, then they may be able to really see how they fit into the broader picture. And speaking of how they fit into the broader picture, another thing that happens all the time is people think, well, you know, it's just a lot of talking. People just sit in a room and they talk and nothing happens. And I think that we really have to be able to utilize the work product that the working group has come up with and demonstrate through past example. Listen, if you serve on a working group, it's going to be not just worth your time, but we're gonna do something with the hard work. It's not just gonna be for nothing. And I think that all of those things together contribute to an environment where people feel like, all right, yeah, I'm willing to give it a shot. But I do take your point. I do take your point that part of it may be selectivity bias, but the other part of it is just finding people. And one of the things that I noticed that in state government, we have this practice of, you know, when a state official retires, barely 4 months passes before they're appointed to a commission. And we're just recycling and churning the same people and not really creating new pathways for broader involvement. And so I think that allowing for people to have those crash courses, long runways, mentorship opportunities can help to broaden the pool that we're drawing from. Jay, I saw your hand up momentarily. Did you want to add anything to what I just said or to the senator's remarks?
Chair Bermstead, if it's all right for me to weigh in for a second.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Jay Green, Policy and Research Analyst for the Office of Racial Equity here. I use they, them pronouns. I just wanted to mention that I think oftentimes people who work with a diversity, equity, inclusion kind of lens can sometimes there's sometimes an accusation that we're not being impartial when we advocate for equity and inclusion and diversity and such. And I'm certainly not accusing the last, I'm sorry, I didn't know who was making the last set of comments about impartiality. I'm certainly not accusing you of saying this. But I wanted to mention that impartiality is sometimes used as a sort of tool to ask people to shrink themselves and not represent their full selves or their full identities. Because, you know, if I, as a transgender person, speak up and say, I'm concerned about this policy not being inappropriately, creating an inequity for transgender or gender nonconforming people, then I'm accused of not being impartial. So I just wanted to note that the word impartial can be sometimes wielded against people with marginalized identities to ask them to quiet down a little bit. But again, not accusing the last member of this committee who just spoke of using it in that way. Just wanted to flag that as something that we see often, and just reinforcing that no one is truly free from a bias or a position. We all have our own inherent thoughts and feelings and opinions that we always bring to any discussion. But thank you very much for taking my comments.
Chime in anytime. This is a discussion.
All right. Let's go to charge number 4. Actually, I want to note I've been now talking and coughing at you for over an hour. Does the committee tend to take breaks? Should I quiet down for a while?
We're going to take a break at 1 o'clock. So
Okay.
right when we're finished up. So
Okay. So charge 4. So this slide looks kind of slanted, and that's on purpose. The language specifically from charge 4 is codifying mechanisms for controlling and restraining the increasing number of commissions, boards, and joint legislative committees. So yeah, basically talking about all the work groups that we have. So I have it here listed as controlling and restraining. Now we know that that's intended to talk about that modifies the number of committees. But the reason that I highlighted this language in particular is because what I want to caution us against is controlling and restraining whether or not certain conversations are allowed to be had in the first place. Not creating a working group on a particular topic can sometimes mean that topic doesn't get addressed by government. And so in that way, we're controlling and restraining the dialogue or the ability to have a dialogue. I know that's not the intention of this bill or this committee, but I think that it is a potential misstep that we could fall into. And so naming it is really important. So controlling and restraining the number of working groups. I am going to actually start with an excerpt from my report to the legislature from this past January. And again, this excerpt also is featured in the longer document we're going to provide you. What I wrote was that all branches of state government are recommended to reassess the landscape of work groups. And in particular, I was talking about DEI focused, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion focused work groups, with this sort of checklist of questions, some of which we've already talked about today. 1, whether you need a new work group for a particular task or topic, whether existing work groups could just take on any of those new duties instead, and of course, be adequately resourced to do so. That's a very important flip side of that coin. 3, whether any new work groups really need to exist in perpetuity or whether they can be task and finish groups that dissolve after they complete a particular task. 4, whether a new work group is going to call on the same set of community members who already sit on other working groups. 5, whether the compensation is going to be appropriate given the amount of work that's required by them. And 6, what work product or deliverable is expected of them, and whether it's actually going to be efficiently and effectively utilized by the state. So those were some of the big concerns. Again, we've talked about some of them already, but I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've seen in the past that have been a challenge for new work groups. So one of the things is when we get a statute that creates a working group that prescribes the number and the cadence and the format of a work group's meetings. And when I talk about format, what I'm saying is like in-person versus hybrid, that kind of thing. Instead of doing that, so the reason that can be challenging is because sometimes you get the presumed experts in the room who are the members of the work group. And it's really clear that they say, no, we can't do that in that amount of time. This is not a 6-week project. This is not a 3-meeting project, right? But sometimes they are hamstrung by the guideline set forth, by the mandate set forth in the statute. And what that ends up doing is cutting short the work that they're able to perform because they're so focused on meeting the legally required timelines or other requirements that they're not actually able to focus on getting the work right. They're focused on getting it done to the letter of what they were told to do. Another thing that we see is defaulting to requiring reports from groups by a certain date. I'm sorry, let me go back. The reason that that first one is relevant to managing the number of work groups is oftentimes when a work group is created and it's not given enough time or enough meetings to perform its duties, we end up with incomplete work. Sometimes you'll get a report back that says, we were able to, make recommendations on the first 3 things that you said, but not on the second 3 things. We recommend that you create another work group. And all that's doing is perpetuating the cycle of creating and dissolving working groups on the same topic. So if we're too prescriptive in the number, cadence, and format of meetings, we end up risking not getting the work done thoroughly and completely, thus needing another study committee or another work group or what have you. Next one, defaulting to requiring a report by a certain date, and usually that date tends to center the legislative calendar. Now, I completely respect the fact that the legislature wants to act on the reports and recommendations that working groups give. And, well, there's a specific time in the year when that can happen. So completely respecting that process, one of the problems with that is that we may not be able to get final recommendations to you by the beginning of session or by the drafting deadline. And the risk that we run with that is, well, if we can't get it to you by beginning of session and it doesn't get introduced in a bill or by crossover, now we're waiting until the following legislative year, or worse, this next biennium, in order to introduce recommendations. And nobody wants to run that risk, which is why people just work as hard as they can to get you something by the deadline. Now, sometimes people are able to do that and are able to produce well thought out, well researched, and solid work product. But sometimes working groups end up having to either cut corners or not give it the full attention that they want to give it in order to meet those mandates. Another thing that comes up often when we are on working groups is we will say, hey, we need to engage the public on this topic so that our recommendations can be well-rounded and community informed. But oftentimes we're told, well, there's no time for that. There's no runway. We can't do that by January. We can't do it by December 1st. And so that ends up meaning that we either have to A, ask you all for extensions, or B, not do parts of the work that we see as critical. So the reason that that relates back to managing the number of working groups, again, is because if we're able to meet the legislative mandates of reporting by certain dates, then okay, cool, that works. But if not, then what ends up happening is we either delay recommendations for a following legislative year, or we end up having ideas that are not really fully effective. And then we end up having to come back a year or 2 later to adjust it or to create a new group to fill the gap or what have you. I'm thinking of, for example, we had an existing hazing, harassment, and bullying council. And then now we currently have a working group on student protections from hazing, harassment, and bullying that I chair. And it kind of has superseded or interrupted the work of the original HHB group because the membership overlaps to a staggering level. Now, that second group is a task and finish group, so it will dissolve, but most of the members already sit on that first group, the standing group. And so they bring with them all of the same baggage of that standing group. As far as we all know, it still feels like we're in a regular HHB meeting, even though technically it's a shiny new group. So that's just one example. I don't mean to single them out for any reason, but it's one example of how we create a superseding / intervening group on the same topic as a standing group that has a very short runway to complete a report. Actually, I just sent over a request for an extension of deadline for that because we've got so much to say and to deliberate and to consider with what feels like a really scary short timeline. Next is considering moving on, instead of us moving on to new reports from new work groups. It's important that we revisit the existing findings and recommendations that have already been delivered to the legislature or to the administration or to whomever is supposed to receive them from those relevant work groups. So sometimes we'll have stale recommendations on a particular topic that are well thought out and reasoned and community consulted and all of that, and they may not get acted on in the instant session, and then by the next session or by the next biennium, we're already thinking, well, we should have a set of recommendations. Let's ask a particular group to make one. And sometimes it's easy to lose track of past ones that are still able to be acted on. So not losing sight of or losing track of past recommendations is going to be really important. And that also helps us to reduce the number of unnecessary working groups because we're able to utilize existing work product that we've already solicited and compensated for without having to generate new work products that may end up giving us the exact same recommendations or results. And the last one I have listed here is instead of statutorily prescribing the detailed demographic characteristics of work group members, instead, let's think about the impact of creating quotas or tokenizing people. And instead, let's utilize other ways to include people from historically marginalized or oppressed groups. That goes to the conversation we just had in the last chart. But, basically, it's, again, not everybody who fits a demographic characteristic is necessarily informed about that demographic group's situation. I would rather have people who are going to be justly representing groups rather than just visually representing groups. And so thinking about what is really the contribution that we're getting from all of the members of a working group, and making sure that if we're creating new groups, that it's going to be meaningfully inclusive and not just sort of more of the same. I'll pause here for reactions or questions.
All right, yeah, sure.
You sure? I don't know. Thank you very much for the opportunity. When I particularly look at this last few minutes of this particular 224 bills have already been presented for the next legislative session. The massive amount of duplication, the next amount of people, the turnover that happens, we'll move into another biennium. This sounds so applicable to all of the reason that generated the idea of a government accountability committee, which is probably how I got on here in the first place, saying we never look back at everything that's already going on. The turnover, the change in people, the dropout of the work groups, the competency of the people leading it, et cetera, how loud they are. There's so many impacts on whether these working groups do or do not finish, how much they accomplish. It sounds you can just change working groups to committees, to bills, to a whole lot of other things. The recommendations, the considering points seem to be applicable to almost every step and aspect of how we put things together that we face every day. And I just find that it becomes a huge circle. Putting these same kind of concepts and considerations seem to apply way beyond just our worker portion of our work here and our legislative work and watching it, only my short time of watching it. These seem to be reoccurring themes throughout.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. And, and I think sometimes in the legislative world, and I'm drawing on experience here in Vermont, but also in New York government, oftentimes I think that when there are new members of a legislative body or there's a new term, our attention spans kind of reset and we say, well, we've got to do new work on existing issues. But that doesn't always mean you have to pick up new ideas or you don't always have to start from zero. And so I think that institutional knowledge and institutional memory, part of that, yes, can come from people who stay on and who stay present. But the other part of that is just revisiting past work product and not having to reinvent at every stage. I'm reminded of a working group here in Vermont. I'm not going to name the group, but they were asked last year, so session 2022, they were asked to come into one of the committees and to provide recommendations on a criminal justice matter. And that group the year before had issued a report with all of those recommendations. And that same committee had asked for. And it was clear that the recommendation just hadn't been looked at. And so the chair of this particular committee just went in and read the bullet points from the report from a year prior. And a lot of the people in the room, they were hearing it for the first time. And it feels as if what I don't want is for working groups to get to the point where they feel jaded enough that they just have to trick policymakers into engaging with the work they've already done because they're being asked for new work that's already been done. So I think that you're right. Actually, I'm reminded of something that was when I was in New York, I learned that there are some jurisdictions in the country that actually limit the number of bills that a legislator can introduce in a given session. And I could feel a couple of you tighten up just now, just at the thought of it. But what I appreciate about that approach is it really forces you to go for quality, not quantity. I mean, I hear you say 200 some odd bills already introduced, and I'm feeling bad for Jay on the call because that's a lot of equity reviews. And so just really thinking about how many of them are going to move, how many of them are worthwhile, how many of them are performative, and what does it really mean for government and for government bloat and for the limited resources you all have as legislators. But I'm rambling, so I'll stop there. Thank you for your comments.
So, Susanna, I would say absolutely everything that we just said, but some of what we're talking about is in our report. And number 7 just it screams to me to read it, so I'm sorry, but establish a process to ensure that committees and committee staff regularly and formally review past legislation, legislative mandated reports, and other materials before we introduce new legislation. And I think that if you looked at the 224 new bills, I bet you half of them you would look back and find that we have something very similar on the books that we could either amend or sunset, or, those are the kinds of things that we need to be doing. And the work groups that you're referring to here in this part of the bill is, or this part of the act is exactly the same, because that's all contained within. And this is frustrating, not only to those legislators who've been here for 4 terms as I have, but also for our state agencies, our groups, all kinds of folks. And so I do feel, and maybe I should be saying this later, but I was on that Government Accountability Committee before for 6 years, and we didn't do the work that we just did in 4 meetings this summer. And so I feel like we're getting there. We're at least putting our finger on the real issues. And hopefully we will see now that our government operations committees will take that work and run with it, because it is so, so, so important. And I love your slides that say, instead of consider, the other one had a third thing, current, I think, or something like that. But these charts are so important for our government operations committees. And honestly, listening to this presentation makes me wish that we did have a lot more meetings that we could sink our teeth into, because we've become educated not only on what you're telling us today, but all the work that has come before today. It shows the importance, incredible importance for this work. So thank you.
Thank you. So I just had 3 more items that I wanted to mention to you that didn't feel like they fit cleanly into the other slides, but that I wanted to make sure we said. The first one is to be clear and deliberate with legislative intent language. And I mean, that's directed sort of at the SGAC, but really more broadly at committees in general in the legislature. We know that bills go through a lot of revisions and a lot of amendments before they reach their final versions. And sometimes intent language that's put in there can get modified or removed. And what we find is that if the intent or if an intent of a bill is that work be done with an equity lens or to be inclusive in membership of work groups or what have you, it is really important that that language be present in intent language and that it remain in there, because oftentimes the removal of that language or the absence of it is then weaponized in ways that make a work group then not able to do its work from that lens. I'll give you an example. I'm currently sitting on a working group. The legislature is going to receive a report from us in another few weeks. And the enabling legislation, when first introduced, was introduced explicitly and specifically because it was seen as a way to reduce racial disparities in the state of Vermont. Over time, the language got watered down, that was taken out. And so now we end up with working group members who fight us at every step of the way saying, we're not supposed to look at this from an equity lens because that's not in the four corners of the final bill that was passed, even though we know that was the onus for introducing it and moving it and advancing it and passing it in the first place. But the language was removed, and therefore it undercuts our ability to keep that focus that was clearly the legislative intent, and it was part of the spirit of the legislation. Another one is to consider setting us up for success through the budgets and the timing. So Office of Racial Equity is often in work groups and other spaces where we say, hey, you know what? We love all of the brains around the table here. We need more brains. Let's get with the community. Let's hear from them, right? Again, going back to that spectrum of community participation that we looked at. The two most common pieces of pushback, because there's always pushback, but the two most common arguments that we hear against it are, we don't have enough time for that because our deadline is January 15th or December 1st or what have you. Or there's no budget for that. And the problem with that is that it effectively makes it so that community engagement is treated as an add-on. It's treated as an extra. It's treated as additional labor that was not originally considered, and that any efforts to do it are seen as charity to ORE. Okay, we'll give you this little thing. We'll do a forum for you that, by the way, we expect you to arrange and lead and support and take notes on and report back on. And so the problem with that is that we end up creating procedures and systems that don't really allow for the full breadth and the full scope of engagement that they should have. So again, consider if you want us to create a deliverable, or even if what you're really looking for is a report, we may need to consult with others in order to generate the content for that report. And that might mean that we need enough of a runway to be able to warn meetings, warn community sessions, and engage with people in a way that meets their needs. If we want to hear from communities who may need interpreters, or if we want to translate materials for the public so that they can give input, we're adding at least a 2-week turnaround time so that we can give materials to our translator partners so that they can turn around documents in other languages. That means that you've got to build all of that into your timeline. And so these are considerations sometimes that for us turn into an uphill battle because it becomes sometimes a question of will and sometimes a question of just not enough quote unquote resources. The last thing that I'm going to say here is all of what we talked about today. I'm grateful for your time and I'm grateful for you listening to me, but please don't just take my word for it. No one person speaks on behalf of all of the members of their demographic group. Even someone whose job says, go ahead and speak on behalf of all these. I don't speak for all people of color in Vermont. I don't even speak for all people of color in my household. And so I strongly just encourage you, keep soliciting the input of other people. Of course, I'm always available and at your service to provide this kind of input, but not every person of color is going to agree with me. Not every Latina is going to agree with me. Not every woman is going to agree with me. Not every millennial is going to agree with me. Not every Lamoille County resident is going to agree with me. And so just really make sure that you're getting quality and quantity. It's not one over the other. It really is both. And the last thing is when you consult with experts, particularly on subject matters like social justice, treat it like it's an expert consultation. Oftentimes this work is viewed as soft work or that it doesn't take intellectual or analytical rigor. And all of that is incredibly false and harmful to the practice and to the subject matter. So if you're consulting with people who have specialized knowledge, treat it as if you're consulting with people who have specialized knowledge, and make sure that people are being compensated for their time, not just for sitting on work groups, but also for coming in and delivering information that other organizations may actually pay tens of thousands of dollars for from a consultant. And just think about what that means for people in terms of the labor that we're asking of them. It's not lost on me that some of the work that these working groups put together in Vermont is stuff that is like full-time employee work. And these are folks who may spend years on a working group. They're no closer to vesting in any pension. They're not getting health care, even though they're constantly on the phone and doing stuff with state people, impacting real policy. And they're just kind of a footnote on a web page. And I think that Vermont is in a place where we're too small of a state yet to be able to easily afford what it costs for all of this. But we're also too big of a state to continue with the model we have right now, where we're relying on nominal payments and volunteerism. It's a very awkward place, but I think we're, as a state, too big to continue with this current model. It's just not where we are. So, yes. So, again, you got some preliminary recommendations from us. After today, you are going to get updated recommendations from us. It's going to be a more detailed version of what we've talked about today. It's going to have more references, resources, and links for some further learning. And we're also going to make sure that this document is publicly available because we think that this is going to contribute to transparency in government and in the way that we advise it. So that is pretty much it from me. I'm going to stop the share and I welcome any questions or feedback you all may have. Thank you for your time.
Are there any questions first? Okay, and feedback?
I'd like to thank you very much for appearing before us today and for the information, the input that you provided. I think it's very helpful in helping us shine a light forward on some things that ought to be done, some things that ought to be done differently, and that some things perhaps that ought to be done better. There's never enough time in the legislature. That's one of the things that I've learned in the years that I've been here. There's never enough time to do all the things that we want to do, and there's never enough money to do it. I am still waiting for the witness to come before us and say that my function has far too much time allocated for what we're charged to do, and we have far too much money, and we'd like to give some of it back. That's something that we never, ever hear, because the work that we have to do is never done. And I think you pointed to some of those things today. The charge of this committee was to do a number of additional things other than the one thing that we think we basically got done. And among the recommendations that we're going to be talking about later is to allocate additional time and resources, not necessarily an additional group, but perhaps a continuation of what we've started during this past summer to really focus in on some of the issues, and in particular, some of the issues that you've mentioned and brought to our attention today. And we hope to be able to do that. So again, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the information you provided. And we're going to look forward to the information that you're going to provide us.
Thank you, Senator.
And thank you, Susanna and Jay. Thank you for being here too. And I hope you feel better. You seem a little better than you did at the beginning as we went through. So I appreciate that. How long do you think it might be before you send us those final recommendations? I'm just curious. We could put them maybe in as an addendum.
20 minutes. I mean, they're done.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. That's great.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we're finished a little early. What we could do is take a break for a little early and then come back a little bit earlier so we could maybe move through and get done quicker. Is that okay? Can we do that from the public's perspective?
Okay, good. Thank you. So it is 20 of one. Oh, sorry.
Before we break, because I will
Yes.
be back after the break because I have to go to work. I emailed you a brief sentence based on our conversation. So one of the things that I think came up a little bit in the presentation that we just had and kind of keeps coming up is having a tool or a framework to evaluate all of our legislation for both equity and accountability. That is sort of built in for committees to use. So one of the recommendations that I'd love to have a brief discussion about or just sort of kind of add in here is identifying and developing a tool that each committee can use to be looking at each piece of legislation to make sure that it adheres to this equity and accountability model. And I know there may be tools in existence and there's a deeper conversation there, but I think that, as Representative Kornheiser pointed out, putting this just all on individual committee chairs is maybe somewhat problematic. Whereas if we give each committee a tool to screen each piece of legislation for, it maybe helps us limit some of the the legislation that is using reports or is asking for reports that we actually already have, or it allows us to just kind of put everything through this framework. And it's literally a sentence that I sent you. I'm happy if it gets shifted and changed, I'm happy to send it to everyone. You just weren't going to know, like, if you got it, you wouldn't have the context. But I did want to put that out there as just an additional piece here.
Okay.
So presumably that's something we can discuss.
Yeah,
when
we
we're
can
back.
definitely.
Yes.
That sounds good. And it looks like Susanna has something she'd like to add. Yes.
Thank you for permitting me to jump in here. I just wanted to say, I'm gonna drop off and just catch the rest of this from the YouTube link afterwards. But if you are going to be discussing an evaluation tool for equity, then I would really, really appreciate the opportunity to come to you all, or perhaps maybe follow up in writing about the impact assessment tool that we use in the executive branch. It is really a very, 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 very strong hope that I keep alive, and I'm watering this plant every day, that the legislature will adopt it as it is. And so I would be really, really happy to have either me or Jay or both of us brief you all on that tool and provide you as a matter of fact, I'll send a copy now to the committee assistant. But I'm happy to follow up about it if that's a discussion you all want to have.
So it would be happy to have you send it if you can do that now so we can review it in our discussion. But this is most likely our last meeting because this is our fourth meeting and we don't have any more time allotted, as you eloquently put in your comments. So I'm sorry, but I will again recommend that the government operations committees, which Tanya is a member of, so I believe that she will definitely be raising this there, and it will be a great spot for this conversation. And I believe that you have our support. We'll talk about it, but I have most of us.
And that's why the recommendation language I sent to you is to recommend that a tool is identified. And then within the committee jurisdiction, I think we would have the deeper conversation about what is that tool and how is it implemented. Because I know our recommendations from just 4 meetings are somewhat high level.
Okay.
Thank you for your consideration. We'll send that over right away.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Senator Renner.
Yeah, the Social Equity Caucus had a list of questions, to my knowledge, last year, and I don't know the status of those. They were supposed to be brought to every committee and every bill was supposed to be looked at through that lens. I don't know what that is called off the top of my head, but lists like that do exist.
Yeah. Is that what built this tool that you all have? Susanna?
Actually, we worked with the Social Equity Caucus members to help inform the creation of the questions they came up with. They referred to it as the probing questions document.
Thank you.
And we by then had already implemented and mandated the use of the IAA tool, the impact assessment tool. So I think ours was informative to the creation of the Social Equity Caucus version. And but there are some differences. And I, again, would be happy to provide something, just a quick letter in writing that maybe does a side-by-side or not even a side-by-side, but just kind of explains the basics of the IA tool and why we use it and why we find it valuable.
Okay, thank you. And Representative Levitt has a question.
Oh, I just first, Susanna, I just want to say thank you. This was remarkably informative. And I hope you feel better. And the Social Equity Caucus, I'm not sure how they're doing this, but I'm a sometime member of that caucus, but I got tapped to be the one in my committee to look out for equity issues in everything that we were doing. So that might be sort of how they're doing things. But I do think having something that's codified, that's consistent across all the committees would be a real boon and just make it easier and just more consistent.
Okay, all right, well, thank you for that information as well, Representative Levitt. So it's 1:15. Let's meet back here at 1:15. Okay, I guess all of our children now say 12:45.